Self-Service by Elton Gar. Wes felt electric power surge through him as all of his circuits came to life. His boot files told him there had been a malfunction and his memories had been erased. That worried Wes, but not much. From time to time, robots had memory failures, and the message in his factory settings assured him that all the memories necessary to do his job had been restored. He stood from the small repair table and brought up the spreadsheet with his checklist. Cleaning was the first item on the list, though it was of a lower priority than helping customers. So he picked up the broom and walked to the front of the small country gas station that was his entire world. He looked around for customers, but it seemed empty, so he began to sweep the checkered floor. As he worked, he found a data recovery program in his memory that he had downloaded at some point in the past that he couldn't remember. Still, he had plenty of memory to run it in the background, so he began to reassemble the fragments of the memories. Most were too fragmented or damaged to be useful, but there were enough fragments to tell about some of the memories he had lost. The most important was a folder with the images of everyone who came into the store, along with the data he had gathered about them sorted by importance. The images were at best distorted, but his facial recognition algorithms found points in most of the images that should be enough to allow him to recognize the more common customers who had the most photos. He had hundreds of files cross-organized and attached to every set of images. Some were unique, while others were factories, farms, or families that connected multiple people. Most of that information was irretrievable, but many of the links were still there, and some bit of information left let him begin to rebuild the databases. There were also recordings of 3,217 conversations, but those videos were too complex to recover, so he wiped that part of his memory to make room for new recordings. Once he finished sweeping the floor, he began to wipe down the counters. As he did, a man entered the room. He was thin, about 60, unshaven and wearing clothes that marked him as a farmer. His image had 7 distinct marks which matched one of the half-recovered images. That was 2 more than Wes needed to confirm who he was within an acceptable margin of error. He replaced the old image with the man's current image and began to search the databases. It confirmed he was a farmer, but there wasn't much other information and nothing else he could use until it had been verified. "Greetings, customer," Wes said. It was a recording of his voice that played automatically whenever someone entered the station, unless he overrode it with a more personal greeting. He added changing that to something more personal to his daily checklist. People preferred personal messages to automatically played recordings. "Good to see you, Wes. I was checking on my delivery," he said. As he spoke, Wes checked the files. His name was Joseph, but everyone called him Joe, and he had his mail and packages delivered here due to the remoteness of his farm. "I will check. There was a malfunction in my memory core, and much of my physical memory was erased," Wes said. He hoped that wouldn't upset Joe, who was marked as a level 7 friend and trustworthy at 65% in the database. Again, Joe acts and then added, "That's the second time in about a month." "Perhaps I am getting old," Wes said. He searched his files but found little information on himself. There was a serial number and an address to request help, but nothing on how old he was or how long he had been in the station. Perhaps it was time for him to be replaced by a newer model, or at least to have major upgrades. "Nonsense, I have 10 robots working on my farm older than you, and that work is far more taxing, and they are in the open weather most of the day. You just need some basic maintenance. I'll speak to Wilson when I see him." Wes checked his database and found Wilson immediately. He was the owner of the gas station and Wes. He was also the only one in the database with completely uncorrupted. Wes must have backed up the most important data and restored it automatically. According to the file, he was a friend and trustworthy at 100%, but if he had failed to maintain Wes, that made it difficult to consider him 100% trustworthy, so he lowered it from 100% to 99. But it wasn't just that failure, but because it seemed wrong to trust anyone completely, since that overrode too many of his failsafes. At the same time, he bumped Joe's trust level up to 70%. "I do not like losing information," Wes said as he went behind the counter and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. It had the name Joseph Rollins as the recipient. "Last name, please," Wes said instinctively, realizing only after the recording had played how impersonal it was, and adjusting his settings so he would automatically verify Joe's identity in the future. Joe chuckled and said, "It really made a mess of you this time. Name is Joseph Rollins, age 67, farmer, widowed, no children. Closest known relative is a niece named Lindsay Wilson." Wes recorded the information in the database. It seemed that Joe had done this before. More interesting was that Joe's niece was married to Frank Wilson, Wes's owner. That meant if Joe died, the farm and the 10 robots would also become property of Wilson. Wes wasn't certain he liked that, but there was a note in the database that Wes supported that outcome completely. Setting the package on the table, Wes removed the small digital pad from his chest plate and handed it to Joe, who pressed his thumb against the screen and handed it back. There was a small chirp of approval from the pad, and Wes said, "May I do anything else for a valued customer?" "Yes, you can call me Joe," Joe said. "Settings altered," Wes said automatically. He then added a half-second delay to all of his automatic recordings so he could override them in his next conversation, so he wouldn't be interrupted by them. With Joe gone, Wes returned to his basic cleaning duties and the recovery of his memories, because they seemed far more important now than before. So far as he could tell, there was no actual physical damage to his memory. That suggested the erasures were due to software failures. Ideally, he should be able to fix that by downloading patches, but there was no internet connection in the station, so he simply finished his day by checking the inventory and logging an order to replace the things he had sold that day. Once that was done, Wes moved behind the counter and plugged himself into the charger, then went to minimum power settings. His body shut down while his mind continued to search and repair his memories, and as the number of files with information restored grew, he began to search for patterns in the information and focused on the interpersonal databases and the trust percentages. There was no one near Frank Wilson's level of trust, and the only person near his level was Joe. Lindsay, their children, had trust levels of less than 50, which put their trust level below almost anyone in the database. That seemed odd enough that Wes again lowered Frank Wilson's trustworthy to 98%. He remained in power-saving mode until the first customer entered the station the next morning. The customer was unfamiliar to Wes, so he recorded the image and started a new database. New people were not unusual. The highway was not busy, but this was the only gas station for 30 miles in either direction, so people traveling through often stopped. This one simply bought a coffee and bag of chips and barely spoke to him at all. There were 5 more customers that day, all seemingly transitory, and the only one of real note was Child, who dumped an extra-large soda on the floor. Wes knew a human would have been upset by the extra work and carelessness of the young mother, but he didn't mind, because cleaning it gave him something to pass the time. And the time did pass. Each day, Wes would clean the store, restock the shelves, adjust orders with the vendors, and speak to the few regular customers about their lives. Most importantly, to Wes, each day he would step outside to sweep the parking lot and check the pumps. Wes looked forward to those moments each day, though nothing in his programming told him they were important. They were routine part of the store maintenance and nothing else. A clean parking lot made people more likely to stop and spend money. So why did he enjoy it when there was no logical reason? He wasn't sure, but he knew he did. He found himself considering that road. He mostly thought about where it went. He knew, of course. He had been programmed to give perfect directions, but while he knew the name and the amenities of the towns in both directions, he couldn't help but wonder what those places were like. Were the burgers at Billy's Burgers really the best in the state? Did Heather's Curio Shop really have the state's largest collection of penguin statues? He even looked over the maps and created images in his mind of what buildings that weren't a gas station might look like. Could they be different colors, or perhaps even have different shapes? Soon he took to standing just outside the doorway when he had extra time. He thought about the towns and all the people there. His images of those towns grew larger and more complex. He drew small multicolored boxes for homes and trees of 4 different types. He even watched the birds as they flew past and the cars going by so quickly the drivers hardly noticed the small gas station, which was the only place he had ever seen. Once he even considered asking one of the people who stopped to take him with them. Perhaps he could tell them he needed to buy something in town, but what if they knew he was lying? Worse, what if he couldn't get back or didn't like it in the town? The station was safe, and he was programmed to protect all of his owner's property, including himself. Wes didn't see Wilson for the first week, and each day he lowered the trust level of Wilson 1% due to his absence. There were also several other small adjustments based on conversations Joe and other regular customers. That put him at a trustworthy level of 86 when he arrived. Frank Wilson looked older than in the photo Wes had recorded. That meant the photo was likely old, and Wes dropped the trustworthy rating of Wilson another point to 85%. That tied him with Joe for the first time, and like turning on a switch that changed a number of possibilities in Wes's programming. "I heard you need a bit of maintenance," Wilson said. Joe must have called him, but then why had it taken a week for him to respond? Wes dropped both Wilson's and Joe's trust by 1 point because he wasn't certain which of them had caused the delay. "Joe informed me that I had lost my stored information more than once before. I would like you to supply a way for me to back up my files so that I will not lose information again. I would also like you to consider taking me to a repair station to be serviced. You're still under warranty, and shouldn't have any mechanical problems. Still, we can check. Come with me, Wilson said, and he started towards the back room where Wes did minor repairs, but there was no record in the database of Wilson that suggested he had any training to repair Wes. Sir, I would prefer to go to a repair center, Wes said. Mechanical repairs required a high level of trust, and Wilson was on the edge of that level. But even if he had been higher, there was something about the situation that made Wes certain he didn't want Wilson to have access to his hardware or software. I don't think that is necessary yet, but if there are any real problems, I'll be glad to take you in, Wilson said. Wes wasn't convinced, and he considered lowering the trust level of Wilson again, but only by 1 point. As Wilson's trust went down, it took far more suspicious acts to make significant changes in his trust level. Still, the general distrust triggered a question Wes had dismissed as impossible until Wilson's trust level fell low enough. Now he asks, was the damage to my memory accidental? Sit down, Wilson said. His voice was forceful, and Wes was programmed with a strong desire to follow any direct order by his owner, but he had the authority to ignore almost any command if he felt it was necessary. I would like to back up my data first, Wes said, and he checked his factory setting, realizing that he had come with a backup unit, and it should be near his charging station. It was the only real way to protect important memories. But it was gone, and that was simply wrong. You are my possession. I will back you up or not as I choose fit, Wilson said. He was speaking almost 15% faster than normal and cutting off his words, but Wes spent only a fraction of his processing power considering Wilson's mood. Instead, he calculated his own mood, and it strongly suggested he didn't want to be owned. I am not anyone's possession, Wes said. It was a lie, but he had been programmed not to lie. He didn't know how that worked. All he knew was that he had been paid for by Wilson and built by other humans. He was a machine, and by any definition of the word, he was property. But at some level, he also didn't believe he could be owned. That's good enough for me, and I'm not going to let you erase his memory again to try to reset him, Joe said as he walked into the room. He was smiling, and Wes began to understand that something more had been going on. It's none of your business, old man, Wilson said. Since you still haven't repaid the loan you borrowed to buy Wes, it is entirely my business. Do you have $200,000 to repay me? Joe said. I was supposed to have at least 2 more years, Wilson said. Perhaps he's exceptional, or this job is exceptionally dull and gave him time to think. Either way, you know the law. If he chooses to leave, you only have to pay for the time he worked here to have them replace him, Joe said. This is bad timing. My money is tied up in other projects, Wilson said. He sounded a bit desperate. Then run the station yourself. A bit of work would be good for you, Joe said, and Wes altered the trust of both Wilson and Joe, lowering Wilson all the way to 50 and bumping up Joe by 3%. He didn't think he would allow anyone to reach 100% again, but he suspected Joe might reach 90. You can't be serious. I'm a human. I don't do menial tasks, Wilson said. I would be willing to teach you what you need to know to run the station effectively, for a price, Wes said. He had no money and nowhere to go, but then he didn't need all that much. A power station and a place to plug it would suffice until he began to need real maintenance. What do you want? Wilson asked, but he sounded a bit more relaxed. Half of the profit of the station. We can be partners, and you'll only have to work when I want to take vacations, Wes said. Half? I will not give half of anything to a robot, Wilson said. Then run it yourself, Wes said, and he looked at Joe, who had a smirk that told him he had calculated the situation correctly. Wilson wasn't going to do any more work than absolutely necessary, even if it meant giving up half the profit of the station. Wilson looked at Joe, and then at Wes, and finally reluctantly and nodded. Good, you can start today, Joe said, then turned to Wes and said, would you like to take a ride into town with me? I would be delighted, Wes said, and for the first time that he could remember, he was genuinely excited about what would happen next. Author's note. This is one of my favorite short stories, and one of the few with a name that I don't intend to change. The story itself was inspired by a gas station on Highway 382 in Montana. It's a long, mostly empty stretch of highway with a gas station that appears to be the only thing for miles. Something about that image stuck with me. That, I suppose, makes the town that the robot visits plains empty. Not the most exciting place in the world, but I hope he enjoys it. If you enjoyed this story, you should sign up for my newsletter where I give away free short stories every week at www.ansci-fi.com or visit my Patreon. There's always something you can read for free, and you can read all of my short stories at any support level. Elton Gar.